whenever you want.
Okay, so my journey to faith took a very, very, very long time, about 44 years to be exact. Um, I grew up in a Jewish home. My father was Jewish, and my mom had been raised Southern Baptist but converted to marry my dad. Um, Religion wasn't something that we talked about, and faith was not really something that we discussed. We went to Sunday school at the synagogue from kindergarten to sixth grade. And at that point, my dad gave us the option of whether or not we wanted to be bat mitzvahed or not. And my sisters and I decided not to be. So at that point, my dad pretty much stopped going to the synagogue completely. And we really didn't participate in any Jewish observations at all, except intermittently from the time that I was in sixth grade until now. And I don't believe that he practices even to this day. We did, as children, celebrate Christmas and Easter with my mom's family. But again, Christ was not something we discussed. We didn't really have any understanding of what Christmas or Easter were about. And it wasn't anything that we talked about. My family just, the subject never came up. It just wasn't anything that we really had conversations around. So we grew up with no real foundation of faith, no understanding of Judaism or Christianity, really. And because my parents were kind of private people, we weren't really an emotionally connected family. We kind of were left on our own to kind of navigate through life. And when that happens, when you don't have a compass spiritually and you don't really have a compass here with your own family, and you're left to your own devices, you make a lot of really bad choices. And that was really kind of what happened to me. I didn't understand that there was a heavenly Father. I didn't know what having a relationship with God was like. I didn't have any inkling that you could be engraved on the palm of his hand, or that he would have knit you in the womb and knew you before you were born. Those concepts totally, I just had no clue. So I felt alone a lot. I felt like a misfit a lot. I felt like I didn't fit in and I didn't belong and I had no real value. And when you feel that way, you're looking toward externals for validation, other people to make you feel like you matter. And I did that in my male relationships. When I got old enough to date, I looked for them to fill that void. I realized years and years later, no human, no person can possibly do that. I remember reading something that C.S. Lewis said, something like, the longings that we have here, if they cannot be fulfilled by anything on earth, it must mean that we were meant for another world. And I truly do get that. I understand that. But I didn't understand it then. I got married right out of college. We had children right away. And my husband at the time didn't want to be married. He didn't want the obligations that come with having a family and being committed in that way. He wanted to continue to just be free and do what he wanted to do. And so that relationship, needless to say, ended in a divorce. And before that relationship was even finalized, before that divorce was final, I was already involved with somebody else. I didn't want to be alone. I didn't want to face raising children by myself. I didn't want to experience the stress and the fear and the anxiety that goes along with doing all of that without support. And my parents, although I love them, were not the kind that were going to say, yeah, move in, I'll help you out. It was more or less the you made your bed, lie in it, figure it out. And so the idea of having someone else come in and sort of save the day was very appealing to me, because then I didn't have to struggle and I didn't have to do it by myself. And I didn't realize who I was dealing with, which was the unfortunate part. He was okay with being involved in a relationship. He was perfectly fine with taking on my 2 children from my previous marriage, but he was not okay with marriage. He did not want to be committed. He was perfectly fine with bringing other children into the world, which we did have 2 children, but he didn't want to commit. and I would find out later why, but he didn't want to. He was perfectly fine with the kind of pop culture Hollywood mentality of you can have a relationship and not be married. It's an antiquated concept. It's just a contract. It doesn't mean anything. We can chart our own course. We can decide for ourselves what is right. And because I didn't want to be by myself, I fed into it, bought into it, and it was like, okay, fine, you're right. We can do this. And I figured because of the kind of personality that I have that I could fix it, I could make it work, and it would all be fine. It was a train wreck. It was an absolute disaster. He was an entrepreneur. He had his own business, and he, about 6 years into our relationship, fell under investigation for criminal fraud. He had fraudulently signed a government contract, transmitted it by email to an investor. The investor believed the contract to be valid, sent him investment money, and then he used it for purposes other than what it was intended. Secret Service has a task force that investigates such crimes, and they determined there was enough evidence to prosecute. I didn't know that all of this was going on. I had no idea that this was happening, because I had basically entrusted my whole life, my accounts, including my bank account, my credit cards, everything. I just kind of passed on to him, and he was responsible for handling it and managing it all. And I didn't know what he was doing. And whenever I would ask questions or try to understand what was going on, he became very defensive and kind of positioned it as if I didn't trust him to do the right thing, then we had real issues and I needed to kind of get myself in check. And rather than ruffle feathers too much and keep the peace and just kind of allow things to remain status quo, I just didn't really lift the veil too much. And it wasn't really until I was subpoenaed to show up at the grand jury trial where I was presented with evidence that he had also forged my name, used my credit, my accounts, my bank, everything, to also do some of these business deals that were fraudulent in nature. And that's when it really when things kind of shifted for me, when I realized that my whole world for about 7 years had been a complete lie, that I couldn't count on anything that he said. I didn't really know what was truth or fiction. I didn't know what my path forward was going to be. I didn't know how I was going to take care of our kids. I was completely just obliterated. And I don't know that you can really put into words adequately how that just decimates you from the inside out when you realize that nothing that you had based your life on was true. And there may have been bits and pieces of truth in there, but you didn't know which ones. And so it just kind of boggles you. And there I was. He's about to go away to prison for 34 months, and there's no plan. I hadn't worked in 7 years. I had no idea of how I was going to provide support for my kids. We were at the time living in a dilapidated farmhouse on 13 acres of farmland in Lovettsville. I had no family nearby. Because of the circumstances, I had lost all my friends. I had no money, nothing. And he wouldn't talk about it. So we weren't able to kind of formulate a path forward for me and the children because he wouldn't discuss it. And then the day came where he had to turn himself into authorities, and there I sat. I think he had been convinced that they were going to find some sort of loophole and he wasn't going to truly go away. And so he just wouldn't discuss how things would proceed once he left. But that's when I started to see miracles in my life. And that's where God really kind of entered in. And at the time, like I said, I had no real faith. So I wasn't doing the praying the way most people would. I wasn't, and my family didn't know. I kept a lot of things hidden from them because I was humiliated and I was completely ashamed of some of the things that had happened. And I didn't know how to tell them without feeling like I'd be judged what was going on. So there was no way for anyone in my world to have come in and sort of prayed for what my needs were, because no one knew. So I'm sitting there devastated, not sure what to do next. And I get a phone call. Because he had been under investigation, he wasn't allowed to have his own business anymore. He had to seek work. And because he was such a smooth talker, and because he was very charismatic, and because he was able to pitch himself very effectively, he managed to get himself a job with a government contractor who specialized in digital signage technology. And at that time, it was around 2008, the war was still in full effect, and people needed the capability to have these command centers off location that would allow them to communicate with troops and contractors in the field. And he had knowledge of that technology, and he knew how it all worked, and he sold them on the idea that he could help them come up with this great command center that was state of the art and would set them apart, and they would win all this government work. And they bought in. And they hired him, despite the fact that there was this pending, looming trial against him, and that he was likely to be prosecuted against and found guilty. They still hired him. Well, the CEO of the company, after he kind of fell off the map and they didn't understand why, contacts me, and I have to explain what's going on and what the situation was. And he asked me to come in and bring all the documentation that I could get my hands on regarding the case. And so I did. And I didn't know it at the time, but he was a Christian. And he basically said that he read through all the documentation. He asked me for my take on what was going on. And at that time, it was literally maybe 3 or 4 days after he had left that I had this discussion. And so I was still kind of floored and numb and not really sure how to make sense of anything. And not 100% convinced that he had done it, because he kept telling me that there was some flaws in the case and he was going to get out. And I didn't know what to do or how to make sense of it. So I was kind of on the fence. Did he do it or not do it? I didn't know. So because that was my position, the gentleman was like, well, why don't I hire you at his salary? And that way you can take care of the kids while he's gone. And it wouldn't be the same line of work, but it would be in my field, what I had gone to college and got a degree in, and I would be able to assist them and still provide. That was the first miracle for me, because I really didn't even know where to begin to pray. I didn't know what to begin to ask for. I didn't know. I was drowning and I needed help, and I didn't even know where to start. So this was the first miracle. But we were living in this dilapidated farmhouse in Lovettsville, and I was away from my family, and I had no support, and I had no friends, and I needed to get closer into town, closer to people and closer to support. But I couldn't break my lease, and I had about 6 months left. And this is where another miracle happened. I got a letter in the mail that the owner of the rental property had declared bankruptcy, and that I was to move. I had to move. And there was a contact number on the end of the letter, and I contacted him right away because I didn't know when I was supposed to be out of there, and I had no prospects for a place to live, and I had no idea what to do. So I contacted him, and he assured me I had 60 days. But the miracle was that because my credit had been so wrecked, as I was going through this process of looking for applications and trying to get into a rental property, no one would accept me because my credit was awful. It had been destroyed. I needed a 2-month security deposit to put down for anyone to accept my application. The fact that I didn't have to pay for those 2 months' rent enabled me to save the money to put the deposit down so my kids could move. Again, I didn't know what to ask for. And this is what I've learned. God is working behind the scenes when we don't even know where to start. He's putting the right people, the resources, the things in place that save us when we find ourselves in those drowning situations. I didn't know how to pray. I didn't know what to pray for. I didn't know anything other than I had 4 little faces that were counting on me to figure it out. That I had to find the answer and I couldn't give up. And I didn't know what that looked like. I just knew that I had to figure it out. And these things fell into place for me. And that's when I started to sense God's presence in my life. But for a long period of time, I kind of kept him on the peripheral. It was like I would reach out when I needed it, but for the most part, I was still relying on myself. I still counted on my own capability, my own aptitude, my own intelligence, my own strengths to push through things. And I would just call on when I needed that added support. I didn't understand the concept of Christ. I kind of felt for a while he was kind of this middleman thing. And why do you need that when you can just go over here and just reach out to the real source and just get what you need? And only when you need it. I didn't understand how to have a relationship or what any of that meant until about 2013, 2014, the very end of 2013, when my whole life hit complete rock bottom. Their dad had come out of prison, was in and out of their life, and I was struggling to make ends meet. He wasn't paying child support. I needed that money, and it was about $13,000. So I went to the Department of Child Support Enforcement, and I pushed the issue. And we both showed up at court, and he was told that he had to pay it in full within a couple of months or he was going to jail. He had his girlfriend at the time pay the $13,000 that he owed to avoid jail term, and then he went for my jugular vein. They basically went back to the courthouse, filed for sole custody of our children and a change in visitation. And he was citing parental alienation as the factor that caused this, saying that I had deliberately made it so that he could not have a relationship with our children. And in the state of Virginia, if they can prove parental alienation, you can lose your kids. So I hired an attorney because the idea of losing my children was like cutting out my heart, and you may as well have just run me over because I wouldn't have survived that. And she didn't say, oh, there's no chance that could ever happen. It was, yeah, that can happen. And this is serious. And that was kind of the point for me where I realized that I was kind of dancing with the devil at that point. I was beyond my capabilities. I was in over my head, and I was fighting against someone who would be ruthless and wouldn't play fair and had no problem with lying or fabricating evidence, falsifying information. He would do all of it just to see me hurt. It had nothing to do with the children, but I still had to fight. And that's where, for me, I was kind of at that crossroad. And I thought, all right, I can't do this. I can't. And my little peripheral relationship is not going to work here. I'm way over my head. I have met my Goliath, and I'm going to lose. And the idea of losing my kids was just something that was too much to deal with. And that's when things kind of shifted. I was home working remotely, and my doorbell rang. And it was a lady on my doorstep, and she happened to be a Jehovah's Witness. And I was a mess, kind of like I am right now, and I couldn't hide it. And she saw that, and she asked if she could just come in and pray for me. She didn't give me literature. She didn't try to push an agenda. She didn't ask to talk to me about her faith or her belief. she just sat me down on my couch and prayed for me and let me share my story with her and just listened. And what I so appreciated about that was she met me where I was. I didn't know what to believe. I didn't have any understanding really of faith or God or Christ or anything. And it wasn't even about that. She just treated me like a person who she saw was in need and took compassion and just listened. And that opened my heart to the idea of having a conversation with her later about who Christ was. And she came to my house for a year, almost every week. And she would just sit with me and we would read scripture together. And she showed me how to read the Bible, how to get to know God and Christ through just reading his word. I had never done that. I didn't know how to do that. She sat and she prayed with me, and just listening to her pray showed me how to do it, how to connect in that way, how to grow in a relationship. I didn't know that either. As time would pass, and I wasn't just listening to her, because through time, yes, she did start to explain what a Jehovah's Witness belief is. And I wasn't just listening to that. I was listening to other sermons. I was reading books. I was doing my own research too in connection with her. And we took divergent paths, obviously. And that relationship eventually kind of faded. But I credit her so much for just building a foundation for me that I didn't have before, that I could then use to kind of grow. And at the time, I had met my now husband, and he was a believer and had been baptized as a teen. And although he had kind of faded in his faith, it's not that he lost his faith, he just wasn't really doing it with any regularity. As I would have questions, or I would challenge things, or I would question and doubt, he was always there to kind of pull me back and challenge me and keep me grounded and kind of refocus me. And so he was growing at the same time that I was learning and growing, and our relationship just became really solid as a result of this entire experience. While this battle is ensuing and we're engaged in real warfare, so to speak, we're also growing in our faith and our love for God. And that's where I grew to understand who Christ was as a person and what Christianity truly meant. And that you can't have Christianity without Christ. You can't pick and choose the parts you want. You can't take him out of the equation and still have it. It doesn't work like that. And I learned it more and more, thankfully, because I was listening to people like Ravi Zacharias. Even though in my heart I wanted so badly to believe that I had a big God who loved me that much, who would sacrifice his son on my behalf, who died for me, which would fill all that emptiness that I had carried for so long. My head couldn't catch up, and I needed someone who could show me how to link the two. And Ravi Zacharias, and the way that he explains through apologetics and that whole perspective, shifted gears for me. And one of the things that he quotes is Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis's book. And I think reading that book was really the real turn for me, the real turning point, where he says that you can't just believe that Christ is a great teacher or a great philosopher. You don't really have that option. Either he was a raving lunatic or he was who he said he was. Those are your only choices. So I had done all this research, I had done all this reading, I was praying, I was reading scripture, I was talking about it with my husband, I was just insatiably trying to get as much information as I could, and I finally asked myself, what is your holdup? What is your problem? Like, you have all the evidence, you have the data, and it came down to a matter of choice and will. Now that I have it all there, it's right in front of me. Either I believe or I don't. And it was a Blaise Pascal quote, sort of if I believe and I die and I'm wrong, I've lost nothing. But if I don't believe and I die and I'm wrong, I've lost everything. And that was kind of the thing, all of those things in combination. I said, okay, I'm all in. I'm 100% in. And I look at this baptism really as an opportunity to kind of, thank you, close the gap and start over. A second chance to kind of live my life here on out the way it is truly intended, knowing that someone far more significant than anybody in my life loves me with such depth and has taken care of me the whole way, even before I knew him. I can think of nothing better than to live my life for his glory from now on. And I hope that for anyone who might have doubt or anyone who might be unsure, that my story helps maybe in some way turn that corner for you too.